Let us turn in our Bibles to the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 5. Matthew's Gospel, chapter 5. For many young people, their 17th birthday marks a major landmark in life because that is when they're able to start learning how to drive. And some of us, perhaps many of us, can look back to that 17th birthday when we got that provisional license, and we were delighted that we could now start learning how to drive. And consequently, a popular 17th birthday over the years and still today, a popular 17th birthday is a pair of L plates purchased on the internet at £2.50. And if you are a parent, you may be thinking to yourself, well, that's a cheap birthday present these days. I'll need to remember that when my children turn 17. Well, before you get too excited, let me warn you that although the L plates cost £2.50, getting them on your car insurance can cost up to £2,500 these days. The L plates are the least of the problem. But regardless of the cost, you think it's a good investment, and so you start teaching your child how to drive. Everything seems to be going fine, and consequently 6 months later, you tell them to apply for their test. A few weeks prior to the date of the test, you say to them, perhaps it would be a good idea to take a few lessons just to add the finishing touches to the excellent tuition that I've given you. And so that is what they do. They contact a driving instructor and they ask for 5 lessons. And what does the instructor say 10 minutes into the first lesson? He says, 5 lessons. He says it's going to take 5 lessons just to undo all the bad habits that your parents have taught you. You speak to a driving instructor, or any other kind of teacher for that matter, and they will tell you that it's often easier to teach someone from the start than it is to teach someone who has already been taught, but taught wrongly. And did you know that is precisely the challenge that Jesus faced as he taught in the Sermon on the Mount? And that is why we hear him say repeatedly, that is why we hear him say 6 times in the remainder of chapter 5, you have heard that it was said. That's what you've been taught. But I tell you, yes, they've been taught something in the past, but they've been taught wrongly. And so Jesus is now going to teach them correctly. Now, many people have understood that what Jesus is doing in the remainder of Matthew chapter 5 is challenging and perhaps even correcting the Old Testament law, as if Jesus was effectively saying something like, the Old Testament law tells you this, but I now am telling you this. But that is not what is happening here. And we know that it's not because such an interpretation would blatantly contradict what Jesus has just said. For example, in verse 17, he says, do not think I have come to abolish the law of the prophets. I have not. And again, in verse 18, he says, not the smallest letter will by any means disappear from the law until everything is accomplished. And so, having insisted on the permanent nature and the continuing relevance of the Old Testament law, it is highly unlikely that he would now challenge it or contradict it, is it not? Instead, what he is challenging is the commonly held interpretations of the law in his day, and particularly those of the Jewish religious authorities. Down through the centuries, religious teachers had taught their interpretation of the Old Testament law, and it is their words that Jesus is referring to at the start of these 6 sections. That is why he says each time, you have heard that it was said. If he was quoting the Old Testament law, he would not have phrased it, it was said. Instead, he would have said, it is written. It is written. That is how Jesus nearly always introduces a statement from the Old Testament scriptures. But here he is challenging not the written word of God, but the verbal traditions of the religious teachers. He doesn't begin each section by telling them what the Old Testament said. Instead, he begins by reminding them what they have been told it said. And the first thing we learn as he does so is in verses 21 and 22. And there we learn about the true implications of God's law. The true implications of God's law. Now, if you were here last week, then you may remember that Jesus made that remarkable statement in verse 20 when he said, "For I tell you that unless your righteousness surpasses that of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, you will certainly not enter the kingdom of heaven." It was quite a statement to make, and it's one which perhaps may have taken you by surprise. Well, what we have from verse 21 through to the end of the chapter are several examples of what Jesus meant in verse 20. What we have from verse 21 through to the end of the chapter are several examples of how the citizens of God's kingdom are characterized by a righteousness which is different from that of the Pharisees. And the first example that he uses is the Pharisees' understanding of murder. You have heard that it was said to the people long ago, "Do not murder, and anyone who murders will be subject to judgment." Now, one of the reasons why, to give a little bit of credit where credit is due, one of the reasons why people have thought that Jesus is challenging and correcting the Old Testament law in this chapter is because some of his statements about what has been said to the people over the years is very similar to what the Old Testament law says. For example, the 6th commandment, "You shall not murder." And later Old Testament laws explained what the punishment would be for those who did. But the problem with the way that commandment had been taught over the years, and the problem with the Pharisees' understanding of that commandment, was that they assumed. They assumed that its only relevance and its only application was when someone actually killed someone. And therefore, as long as they never committed murder in the literal, physical, bloodshedding sense of the word, they would put a tick beside the 6th commandment, and they would proudly assume that they had kept it. But, says Jesus in verse 22, it's not quite as simple or as straightforward as that. You see, what the traditional teachers of the law never stopped to think about was the character and the motives and the emotions and the sins that lay behind the physical act of murder. As far as they were concerned, you could be the most angry, you could be the most hateful, you could be the most spiteful, the most malicious, the most revenge-seeking person on the planet. But as long as you never actually slit someone's throat, to put it crudely, you could boast of keeping the 6th commandment. But that was never how the commandment was meant to be interpreted. The eternal God has always been a God who looks on the heart 1 Samuel 16, verse 7. You remember that occasion in the life of David when all the brothers are lined up and they think that the next king is going to be the strong one and the handsome one and all the rest of it. And they're reminded, yes, man looks on the outward appearance, but God, he peels back the veneer. He looks below the surface. God looks on the heart. And therefore, he is a God who's not only concerned about our physical outward actions, he's equally concerned about the character and the motives and the attitudes that lie behind those actions. And that is why Jesus goes on to explain the full implications of the sixth commandment when he says, verse 22, "But I tell you that anyone who is angry with his brother will also be subject to judgment." A murder is nearly always the product of a sinful, malicious, spiteful, resentful anger towards that person. And that is why, says Jesus, the person who is angry with his brother will also be subject to God's judgment. What Jesus is saying is that his concern and God's concern and the commandment's concern is with that malice and that hatred and that anger on the inside, as well as the visible consequences of those things on the outside. And as you know, one of the ways in which such sinful internal emotions can often manifest themselves is not only in our actions, but also in our speech. And that is why Jesus goes on to say, anyone who says to his brother, Raka, Raka being an Aramaic expression of contempt, is answerable to the Sanhedrin. But anyone who says, you fool, will be in danger of the fire of hell. Rather than splitting hairs as to which is the worst, Raka or fool, the point seems to be that malicious talking to one another or about one another will also lead to God's judgment. A judgment which was expressed back then through the Sanhedrin court and which will be expressed more fully on a future day in hell. And the reason malicious, hateful speech of that type leads to such serious consequences is simply because it stems from the same sinful, angry, spiteful heart that in other cases leads to murder. You see, the God-given commandment forbidding murder has a wider application, and it has a bigger implication than the literal physical bloodshedding act of murder. Rather than just being concerned about the physical act of killing someone, God is also concerned about those times when we carry out a verbal assassination of others. Rather than just being of relevance to our outward external behaviour, it also relates to the attitudes and the motives and the intentions that lurk about in the recesses of our inner being. And it is that bigger and broader application of the commandment that Jesus is drawing attention to in verses 21 and 22 when he says, you have heard that it was said to the people long ago, do not murder, and anyone who murders will be subject to judgment. But I tell you, anyone who is angry with his brother will be subject to judgment. That is the true implications of God's law. And they're implications that you and I need to take seriously this morning. I say that because it may be that you are someone who has always assumed that your track record in relation to God's law is very good. You read the Ten Commandments, and when you get to the end, you think to yourself, Yeah. That's basically how I've lived my life. And therefore I'm okay. And one of the reasons why you've always come to that conclusion is because when you get to number 6 of those 10 commandments, you shall not murder. Well, you've always assumed that it's referring only to the literal physical act of murder. And as you've never actually murdered anyone, you've assumed you've passed the test on that one. Well, if that is what you've always assumed, then it would be good for you to listen to what Jesus says are the fuller implications of that commandment and assess yourself in the light of those fuller and bigger implications. For example, have you ever harbored bitter anger against someone else? Have you ever expressed malicious resentment or revenge in what you've said about someone else? I ask those questions because those are the sort of questions that reveal not only our visible external actions, but they also reveal our hidden internal attitudes. And although such attitudes may be hidden to those around us, they are seen by an all-seeing God. And it is on the basis of what he sees. It's not on the basis of what your next-door neighbour sees. It's not on the basis even of what your husband or wife or children see. It's on the basis of what God sees that we will be judged. And if we're being honest this morning, I suspect we would all have to acknowledge that in view of what Jesus says are the bigger and the wider implications of God's law, we all have to acknowledge that we have nothing to be proud of. We have nothing to be complacent about in the light of a coming day of judgment. That is why Jesus said back in verses 3 and 4 that the kingdom of heaven is inhabited not by those who are proud of their track record, but by those who recognize their spiritual poverty and who mourn over their failure to keep God's law. It's such people who populate God's kingdom, because it's only when we recognize our failure in relation to God's law that we will turn from our law-breaking and trust in the great provision that God has made in the person of Jesus Christ for lawbreakers such as us. And for those of us who are trusting in Jesus Christ this morning, who are not relying on a great track record in relation to the commandments, but are trusting in Jesus Christ, we also need to take these words of Jesus seriously. For the simple reason that they illustrate the type of righteousness. They illustrate the type of righteous behavior that God expects from those who populate his kingdom. Rather than being satisfied with an outer, literal, physical, minimal compliance with the commandment, God is looking for an inner obedience to the commandment. An inner obedience that stems from a changed heart. An inner obedience that challenges and changes our hateful and our hurtful and our harmful attitudes towards other people. He's looking for an inner obedience to his commandment that challenges and changes our deep-seated anger and resentment towards other people, even if it never comes out in a physical action. He's looking for an inner obedience to his law that will stop us from talking maliciously about other people. He's looking for an inner obedience to his law that will prevent us from hurting others either verbally or physically. Don't you think that that is a radically different type of response to God's law from that of the Pharisees, with their minimal, external, visible compliance to the commandment? Of course it is. Don't you think that that is a radically different type of righteousness to that of the Pharisees? Of course it is. And it's not only radically different from their righteousness, as far as Jesus is concerned, it radically surpasses their righteousness. And that is why, verse 20, this is the type of righteousness that God is looking for in the lives of those who inhabit his kingdom. Well, that is not to say that we will always obey the commandment with its fuller and greater implications. We won't, and we don't. And that is precisely why one of the characteristics of those who populate the kingdom of heaven will continue to be and will always be our poverty of spirit and our mourning over our sin. That will continue to characterize the citizens of God's kingdom throughout their entire experience on this earth. But in spite of our failures to keep the commandment at times, that doesn't change the type of righteousness that God is looking for in the lives of his people. A righteousness that truly reflects the character of God. A righteousness that reflects Jesus' understanding of the law of God. A righteousness that reflects the true implications, wider implications of the law of God. That is the type of righteousness that Jesus is looking for in the lives of those who follow him. Moving on, secondly, and you can be relieved that my second and third point is not as long as my first point, but moving on, verses 23 and 24, and there we see the vital need for reconciliation. The vital need for reconciliation. Now, in verses 21 and 22, Jesus has demonstrated how the sixth commandment has enormous implications, not only for the murderer, but for all of us, in the way that we treat one another, and particularly the way we treat one another as Christian people. And therefore, from what Jesus has said, it is evident that the sixth commandment is not merely about crime and criminals. The sixth commandment is also and primarily about our personal relationships. How we relate to those around us, and especially how we relate to those around us within the family of God. And being as realistic as he always is, he's always realistic, Jesus knows that there will be times when those relationships of ours are not what they ought to be. He knows that there will be times when our relationships are strained and perhaps even break down. And so, having warned us in verses 21 and 22 about the dangers of harbouring anger and resentment towards one another, Jesus proceeds in verse 23 with a therefore, and it's a therefore which highlights the vital need for reconciliation on those occasions when our relationships have broken down. Therefore, verse 23, if you're offering your gift, in view of what I've just told you in verses 21 and 22, if you're offering your gift at the altar and they remember that your brother has something against you, leave your gift there in front of the altar. First go and be reconciled to your brother, then come and offer your gift. It's a scenario that is set within the context of first century temple worship. But I'm sure we can quite easily bring it up to date. For example, you wake up on a Sunday morning, start getting ready to come to church, when all of a sudden you remember that your brother, i.e. your fellow Christian, your fellow worshipper at 10:30, has something against you. What do you do? Do you say to yourself, well, it would be good to sort that out with them sometime. It would be good to be reconciled with them at some point in the future, but now's not the time. Not on a Sunday morning. Boy, I've got far more important things to be getting on with. I'm getting ready for church. And going to church to worship my God is of far greater importance than being reconciled to my brother. Is it? Is it? According to Jesus, the more important thing on such occasions is to be reconciled to your brother or sister. Is that not what Jesus is saying in verse 24 when he says, leave your gift there in front of the altar? Sounds as if the service has already started. But leave it there. Just leave it. And first go and be reconciled to your brother. Then come and offer your gift. And you may be thinking to yourself, yeah, but look, surely the most ideal scenario would be that you remember that about your brother on the Saturday evening. And therefore, you can sort it out, and therefore, it's not at the expense of coming to church to worship. Yes, that is the most ideal situation, of course. But why does Jesus say it as it is? Why is the man in the illustration, why does he not remember about his brother 2 days before he came to the temple? Why is it as he's at the temple? It's there like that to highlight the vital importance, the vital need for us to be reconciled to our fellow believers. It's so vital, says Jesus, that should it come down to a choice between reconciliation or worship, what are you going to choose? If it comes down to the choice between reconciliation or worship, then it's reconciliation that ought to take the priority. It ought to take priority for the simple reason that as long as you're angry with your brother or he is angry with you, then at least one of you, and possibly both of you, are violating the 6th commandment, and consequently, your worship may not be acceptable to God anyway. Is that a shocking thing to say? Do you remember what we read earlier in the service from Psalm 24? Who may ascend the hill of the Lord? Who may stand in his holy place? Is it the one who is festering away on the inside with bitter anger and animosity and resentment towards a fellow worshipper? From what Jesus says in Matthew 6, verse 24, I think we can safely say that the answer to that one is no. It's not such a person. Rather than having a role in the worship of God, such a person, says Jesus, is liable to the judgment of God. And therefore, if it comes down to a choice between reconciliation or worship, then it ought to be reconciliation that we make the priority. That's how important. That's how important it really is. That is the vital need for reconciliation. Thirdly, finally, verses 25 and 26. And there we learn about the urgent need for reconciliation. The urgent need for reconciliation. Now, the second scenario that Jesus tells us about is set not within a religious setting, it's set within a legal setting. Verse 25, settle matters quickly with your adversary who's taken you to court. Do it while you are still with him on the way, or he may hand you over to the judge, and the judge may hand you over to the officer, and you may be thrown into prison. I tell you the truth, you will not get out until you have paid the last penny. In other words, says Jesus, better to settle your dispute sooner rather than later, or the cost and the consequences may escalate. Now, if you're not too concerned about the cost of living crisis and you're looking to upsize rather than downsize, then you may be interested in Knockderry Castle on the west coast of Scotland. It's set in a beautiful location, and it's currently on the market at offers over £1.25 million. Bargain at the price. The reason it's on the market is that the previous owners have been evicted due to bankruptcy, and the castle has been sold by the administrators to pay for outstanding legal fees, which the previous owners have run up, legal fees amounting to over £1 million. And the question is, how did they run up such a large legal bill? What was it all about in the first place? Well, believe it or not, it all stems from a refusal to pay a bill for £230 back in the 1990s. If they had paid their debts back then, it would have cost them £230. But having refused to settle the matter back then, and having refused to settle the matter ever since, they now owe over £1 million, and they're losing their beautiful castle to pay for it. Do you see what happens if matters are not settled quickly? They soon escalate. They soon get out of control, and they lead to results which are out of all proportion to what was the original issue. And that is precisely the point that Jesus is making in verses 25 and 26. Don't forget the context. The context is verse 22, someone being angry with his brother. And having told us in verses 23 and 24 about the vital need for reconciliation in such cases, Jesus is now telling us in verses 25 and 26 about the urgent need for reconciliation in such cases. Settle matters quickly, says Jesus in verse 25. Sort it out quickly. Because if you don't, that anger and that resentment, that can fester away and consume you and can quickly escalate, and if allowed to continue, can lead to costly and disastrous consequences. For example, if the anger and the animosity and the resentment which you have towards a fellow believer, if that is allowed to smoulder, if that is allowed to fester, it may in time lead to you speaking to them, or perhaps more likely speaking about them in a way that is unacceptable. If allowed to fester, your anger and your resentment towards them may result in you hurting them, either verbally or emotionally or physically. And so rather than allowing your anger, rather than allowing your animosity, rather than allowing your resentment towards a fellow believer to result in such harmful and hurtful consequences, rather than do that, says Jesus, it's far better to settle matters with your brother or sister sooner rather than later, in case things escalate, things get out of control, and the final outcome is disastrous. That is not only the vital need for reconciliation, that is the urgent need for reconciliation. Three things Jesus teaches in verses 21 to 26. Firstly, the true implications of God's law. Second, the vital need for reconciliation. Thirdly, the urgent need for reconciliation.